original programme for this afternoon had 2 sessions, 3 sessions actually, one on broadcasting, one that was going to be on the whole issue of dark money, the internet, fake news, and a final session. But events, as Harold Macmillan said, events, dear boy, I think we need to have a discussion and to be clear about what we think should happen, both to the BBC. It's not just about the BBC, it's about public service broadcasting. And so that's why we changed the session. And for it, we've added another speaker. Tony Lennon was for a long time chair of the National Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, but he was also president of Bectu for a while, and now he's the research officer for Bectu. So we've added Tony. So this afternoon we've got 3 speakers. Tom Mills, Sian, Jones. I had a moment then, and Tony Lennon. And the running order is you first?
Yeah.
Then Tom, then Tony. And then we've got an extended session of an hour and a half. So it's a chance to have a really thorough discussion about an issue that really the left needs to be clear about where it wants to go with the BBC and public service broadcasting. So I'm really pleased we got this panel. Over first of all to Sian.
So I'm Sian Jones, I'm President of the National Union of Journalists, and I am a press officer by trade, so I've worked in press offices and comms and media jobs for the last 15, 18 years or so. In fact, my first proper comms job was over in York at an insurance company doing operational comms. I've since moved on from there, but I learned a lot about the need for trade unions in such workplaces. So we represent journalists, NUJ represents journalists, photographers, media workers, right across the UK, Ireland and continental Europe, and we're very proud to stand up in defence of public service broadcasting. We obviously have a huge number of members in broadcasting, in particular the BBC, which is the biggest such employer as you would expect in the UK. So, public sector broadcasting. Is the BBC perfect? No, of course it isn't. And as a journalist union, NUJ fights for the BBC workforce every day, and you've probably heard of quite a few of the high-profile equal pay cases that have been going on in the BBC recently, and a large number of those people, those individuals, because there have been individual cases, we're trying to do more collective work across the BBC, but I think there have been some game-changing outcomes in terms of some quite high-profile cases about gender pay discrimination. Our wonderful General Secretary, Michelle Stanistreet, has done some amazing work most recently, securing a really great outcome for Samira Ahmed, who is a BBC presenter. For those of you who didn't know, she was being paid 6 times less than a male presenter to do exactly the same work on a programme called Points of View. So that's clearly not right, and we took that all the way through to tribunal and got a very successful outcome on that. So the NUJ isn't afraid to take on power, and the executive offices and the kind of key editors of the BBC. We do it day in and day out. We have members and reps there who that's their bread and butter. But I think we want to put some of this in a bit of a broader context of what we're talking about today, and talk about, yes, the variety of the output of the BBC. Obviously, public service broadcasting isn't just the BBC, it's also ITV, it's also Channel 4 News, it's also 5 News, it's also a number of the other radio stations, but I think inevitably we're going to be talking quite a lot about the BBC today. So when this conference was called, when you approached us to speak, Granville, we hadn't had Nicky Morgan's licence fee consultation announcement, or bombshell, or whatever you want to describe it as. Now, of course, I'm not going to stand here and say we have to protect the BBC unchanged forever, but I do think it's important that we zoom out here and see the big picture of what is at stake in terms of broadcasting, public service broadcasting in particular. I want to do a little bit of context about this huge umbrella of BBC and public service broadcasting. So my union in particular, we do a lot around news. So news consumption is on the decline, but it's still the highest place that people consume their news is still TV, even though that is on the slide, and social media and internet platforms are on the rise. But 78% of people got their news from the BBC in 2019, according to the Ofcom survey of last year, which is pretty big. It doesn't mean they didn't get news from elsewhere as well, but 78% of people who were consuming news last year got some from the BBC, and 58% of people cited BBC One alone as one of their news sources. So there's a quick note to any press officers in the room: if you want to get noticed and covered, get yourself on BBC One, because that's where their biggest audiences still are. While sort of by comparison, just to give some of the other figures, ITV was 40% and Channel 4 News was 17%. So kind of drops off a cliff from smaller outlets and stations. And in terms of newspapers, the Daily Mail was the highest at 18% on that particular news consumption survey. Could I just get an idea from the room, if you wouldn't mind raising your hands, if you currently work or have worked in the media at any point? So anybody who has or has previously or does currently.
Does general job in printing count?
General job in printing counts? Yeah, why not, comrade? Unite? Great, so I think that's just, it's about somewhere about 40% of people in the room today have or currently work in comms and media somewhere. So we've got, I think we've clearly got a quite high level of media literacy in the room anyway today. But so just to kind of unpack this idea of the BBC a little bit. So when we say the BBC, and the BBC has been said a lot in the room already today, and the BBC gets said a lot in every workplace and front room and a lot of fronts that I've been involved in as well. But when we are annoyed at the BBC, what are we really annoyed at? Is it the 6:30 bulletin on the Today programme that morning? Was it 5 Live? Was it the Emma Barnett show? Was it Politics Live? Was it Watto, PM, Women's Hour, You and Yours, News at 6, News at 10, News Night, Question Time, the Andrew Marr show? Was it regional TV and radio? I mean, and that's just kind of, some of the specifically political news and pure news coverage from the BBC. And there will be different editorial teams and production teams working on each and every one of those shows. So as a press officer, I have been involved in trying to book and booking people onto every single one of those shows, and every single time I speak to a different person because it's a different team of people. So when we're talking about the BBC, there's lots of different parts. It's not homogenous. I mean, journalism in general is not homogenous, and the BBC really isn't homogenous. So there'll be different editorial decisions being taken, different guests being booked, and a variety of different issues covered. And I think the biggest kind of disparity and contrast you get is when you compare regional and local news coverage to national news coverage. And I don't know if Adam is in the room, wants to wave, but he's one of our Leeds members, Adam, who can tell us a bit more about that at another time if he wants to talk about that. BBC Leeds Radio, he's the expert in that. In terms of recent historical context, we've obviously been through potentially, arguably, unprecedented kind of succession of elections and referenda. Obviously we've had general elections in 2015, 2017, 2019. We've had the European referendum, we've had the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, and emotions run very high, understandably, in such elections and referenda. But we have seen some really vile abuse of journalists through those periods, and it's getting worse. And a journalist, like a postal worker or member of catering staff, gets up in the morning, goes to work and does a job, and they're there to do that job, and they should expect to be safe while they're at work, safe and free from abuse, and be able to go home to their family at the end of that day. And sadly, that doesn't always happen now. And as a trade unionist, obviously no trade unionist can condone abuse of workers. So I just want to make that message kind of really clear. During the Scottish independence referendum, we had, BBC Scotland journalists received a lot of abuse during that period, and it was very frightening for a lot of them. I think in particular if you're a female journalist, and it's not just the online virtual space, it can tip over into the real physical world as well, so it can be quite a scary thing to be involved in. But between the 2017 and 2019 elections, complaints to the BBC trebled, which I think is extraordinary, but was the coverage really 3 times worse in 2019 than it was in 2017? I'm just going to leave that there, thing to mull over. And of course now, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've got this mid-term settlement of the licence fee, which is looming. We are currently seeing the effects of the BBC licence fee settlement from several years ago, when the corporation took on responsibility for free TV licences for the over 75s, and that itself came on the back of these cuts. So the cuts, you've probably seen a lot of coverage around this, around Fran Unsworth, who got together a staff meeting at the BBC to speak to staff about what was going to happen. So the cuts, just to recap, so that people who may not know about the current round of cuts, there's going to be about 500 job losses across news, radio and the World Service. So the BBC News division has already made £40 million in savings, and the latest proposals are intended to reach the division's annual £80 million share of BBC-wide cuts. So there were 70 jobs lost at the World Service at Christmas. That was announced at Christmas. Merry Christmas. 380 jobs will be going from news. 60 jobs will be going from network radio. We already know that this is going to mean the closure of the Victoria Derbyshire show. Newsnight will lose 12 posts, and it's going to halve its production of its 4 weekly in-depth films, which has been mentioned this morning, which will reduce the spend on investigative journalism, particularly. 12 posts are definitely going at 5 Live radio. A further 12 jobs are going to go across radio, and there'll be more sharing of radio bulletin content, and there will be 5 news presenter posts cut as well. And that's just what we know about at the moment. That's before whatever happens next. And what happens next? So Nicky Morgan has announced this licence fee consultation. So in the run-up to the election last year, the 2019 election, and in the election itself, you'll probably remember during the election, Boris Johnson on the Andrew Marr show, kind of using this threat of reviewing the licence fee whilst on, sat on the BBC itself. And of course, since the election, we've seen attacks on public sector broadcasting, and they've been quite naked, and then they've ended up with this consultation being launched. And I think it's quite a scary time for the BBC. We've got a Conservative government that's ideologically opposed to what the BBC stands for in terms of its public service broadcasting commitment in particular. This is a Tory government with an 80-seat majority in Parliament. You have to move heaven and earth to get those backbenchers to disobey the whip and vote against Boris Johnson at this early stage in a strong Conservative government like that. So we have this 8-week consultation on decriminalisation of the licence fee. So it's a ridiculously quick and dirty consultation. It's probably going to be a bit of a sham. It's probably not really a consultation about whether they do it or not. It might be something around the fringes of how they do it. It closes on April Fool's Day, the 1st of April, and you can go and put in your views on the gov.uk site. But, the NUJ has said publicly that this amounts to an existential threat to the BBC at the same time that the corporation faces an ideological attack from the heart of government. And we also say it is a really stupid economic move, because the significance of the BBC in terms of the creative industries and small production companies is enormous. And the creative industries contributed £111 billion to the UK economy in 2018, and a strong and healthy BBC helps with that wider industry landscape in the creative industries. And if you're talking kind of post-Brexit landscape, BBC is brand UK as well. Any of us who are going to be lobbying our, sadly now, Conservative MPs, I think that might be quite a key line to be using with them, that brand BBC is really a great export brand. Kind of wind up with a little bit, so in terms of the consultation itself, please do take part in the consultation, either individually, through whatever organisation you are a member of, be that your trade union or whatever Granville may be cooking up. And the NUJ will obviously be putting stuff in as well. It might be a sham, but it's one of the only official vehicles we've got at the moment to be extremely vocal about that. We do really think there is a very grave threat to public service broadcasting, which, according to the Ofcom definition actually is about delivering impartial and trusted news, and its UK originated programmes and distinctive content. So I'm sure we'll go on to talk quite a lot more about that. But just again, the BBC was set up in 1922 to avoid the authoritarian abuse of broadcasting. A lot has changed since then, but for all of its faults and, of course, its potential to be much, much better, without so much of what the BBC does at the moment, we would all be much the poorer. The BBC does the lion's share of getting out to geographical areas that Sky, ITV and the wider ITN family cannot or will not get to. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the kind of pool footage arrangement that happens between the main broadcasters. It is so often the case that it's the BBC that picks up the stuff that the others can't or won't get to, and yet you'll still be able to watch it on ITV News at 10 or Sky News or whatever, wherever it is that you consume your news from. They've obviously, I'm sure we've all got examples of things that we are disappointed or stronger about the BBC coverage, but I'm sure we all also have examples of really great, valuable BBC content and coverage that you couldn't really imagine getting elsewhere, and that's been a real game changer, and that has been originated through investigative or quality news journalism. And it's been said before, I think it's worth repeating it. News is expensive, comment is cheap. And it is expensive to have fully trained, well-trained journalists out in the field doing something that might not just be a bit of clickbait on a listicle that is, the equivalent of internet chip paper, but that is something that will be a real game changer in either policy or political terms. Those things aren't cheap, but they're really valuable. You might not take out a Netflix subscription for those sorts of things, but you'd be some of the first people to decry it when it's missing. We don't have those people there to hold politicians and those in power to account. I just wanted to pick up a couple of points from the previous session about should we be naming and shaming journalists? No. I think if you've got a byline there, you can see, I think your comment came in response to some of the print articles that have been put up. As any journalist knows, you submit your copy and the subs get hold of it. Journalists never writes the headline, journalists never writes the first couple of bars, they're always subs, and you'll never get a sub's name as a byline. So, but I would say that's not the way to go about it, but you absolutely can put complaints in. We've done the newspaper section already. I could go on about newspapers all day, but we're in broadcasting at the moment, so I think I'd really like to encourage us to think about whether we'd like a Fox Newsification of our news service through, the death of the BBC by 1,000 cuts, constant repeats of the Kardashians and kind of trash content, or do we want to really stand up for public service broadcasting in the public interest, quality journalism? And if we do, then we've got a real fight on our hands. We're going to have to fight the Tories every step of the way. And haven't even really touched on the kind of diversity issues that will be impacted if we. The BBC's not great, as I opened with, but they're far better than a lot of the other broadcasters. So I'll hand over to my esteemed colleague, Tom, now to pick up.
In the MediaNorth, the winter issue, I wrote this. Talking about Boris Johnson, you saw when he got elected the way he treated any colleagues who were disloyal to him. And I wrote this. I said that we saw the way Boris Johnson treated colleagues he perceived to have been disloyal. He's a man who holds grudges and settles scores. And I think we need to remember that you've got a Tory party which is not the Tory party, it's the right, hard right of the Tory party in government. And they hate the BBC. You've just got to look at the stuff that goes into some of these papers we've been talking about this morning. There's a DNA in those Tory tabloids and Tory broadsheets hate the BBC. It's there because the owners, like Murdoch, don't want the BBC. It challenges the space they want to occupy. Now, I don't know what Tom's going to say, because that's for him to put his point across, and I hope it's going to be a critical account. But Tom is the author of the book, The BBC Myth of Public Service Broadcasting, which came out in 2016. We've got copies. It's a very good analysis of the BBC, because I do think we've got to be critical and realistic about the nature of the organisation. So I hope Tom's going to do that. Over to you, Tom.
It is, isn't it? Okay. Hello everyone, hi. Thanks for the introduction, thanks for the invitation. I am sometimes called a critic of the BBC, and when I spoke on Newsnight recently, they introduced me as a sceptic of the BBC. I don't know what that possibly means. I am somebody who thinks we should see the BBC as it is, not like we would imagine it to be. And I'm a sociologist and I'm an academic, and I'm not interested in fantastical notions of what the BBC might be, which a lot of people have. I'm interested in what the evidence tells us, what is the record, and what does the research tell us about the BBC. And that's rather different to how we tend to think about these things. So I want to talk about that a little bit, and I want to talk about what I think the implications are for how we deal with this particular political moment when, as has been outlined already, we find ourselves, those of us who are on the left, in a difficult circumstance, because we've gone through I think most people on the left have let's say, more scepticism about the BBC than most, but most people I speak to are very angry about the BBC. Now, when I first started giving talks about the BBC, often I would have a lot of pushback from people saying, you mustn't criticise the BBC because otherwise Murdoch will come and eat it alive. And I usually said, okay, fine, I understand your argument, but I think, we need to have a realistic analysis of social institutions. The BBC is a central institution of our society. It's hugely important to how people understand the world. And it's not just about politics. I want to talk about politics today because that's probably what we're all concentrating on, but also it's what my work is focused on when we talk about the BBC. Of course, it's worth remembering that it's just one function of what the BBC does. Now, a lot of what I want to say is going to build in some ways upon what Justin Schlossberg has already said about the relationship between senior political reporters and the political elites. Now, for those of you who missed that earlier, he was making the point that there's a certain sort of common sense that gets formed within that centrist sort of political elite, and then gets reproduced at the BBC and by these political journalists. And often, this means the violation of basic professional values. And all I think we need to be asking of the BBC, and all I want from the BBC, is the BBC to enforce what its existing policies are. I want a BBC that is independent of the state. I want a BBC which is impartial and reports impartially. We don't want a BBC that simply represents the interests that we support. We want one that doesn't misrepresent that. Now, I don't think that's too much for anybody to ask. The BBC's policies, by the way, are very good. If you read their policy documents, if the BBC did what it says on the tin, then we would have no complaints to make. Now, I don't want to talk too much about bias in the latest general election, but one thing I would say is that there are very serious concerns which were raised over the course of the election, specific things which I could go into some detail talking about, but I won't, because I think we all know what they are. There were things which raised concerns, like, for example, the editing out of laughter on question time, like the debacle around the booking of the Andrew Neil interview with Corbyn, that then failed to secure an interview with the Prime Minister. Now, these may be errors, but the facts of the matter is that they, for everybody who's kept an eye on the BBC, they are symbolic of an institution which seems much more interested in holding the official opposition to account than the government, as was mentioned earlier. It's in the context, and this is to be understood in the context of academic research, the findings of which are very, very consistent. Now, I'm going to suspend my judgment on the last general election by not commenting on any of those things. I would like to comment about the response of the BBC, which I think is the complacency which we now see from the BBC, I find breathtaking, to be frank. But we will wait, right? We will wait till the academic research comes out and see what that says about how they reported the last general election, and then we can move on from there. What we do know already is that almost every major study that gets conducted at the BBC tends to have the same findings, which is that it is political elites who tend to drive and define the content of the coverage. They tend to predominate within news reporting, within the current affairs programmes, and it tends to be those people who define what gets reported. It doesn't mean that everybody else doesn't get an appearance, but basically they tend to be marginalised in BBC output, and we have decades of research on this. So I have opinions about the BBC. In a sense, I don't think they're very relevant to anything. We should start with what the evidence tells us, and the record of that from academic research is very, very clear. Theoretically, how do we think about that? What I've been trying to do with my work is to take what we know about how the BBC reports and try and get under the bonnet and understand why that happens, right? We know the BBC has certain reporting patterns. I think it's fair to say that it's got worse. And what I try to do with the book is try to get under the bonnet of the BBC and understand it's an institution, its DNA, which is a phrase that was mentioned earlier. What is it about the BBC that produces this kind of output? Could we imagine a BBC that's different? And what I want us to do, we had the charter period. The BBC's licence fee is going to be preserved until 2027. That's not because the Tories are nice, it's because it was written into the last charter. They can't refute the funding mechanism in the mid-term review. We could have a new government by then. By the time we get back into power, and I'm because I'm a Labour Party member, by the way, by the time we get back into power, I want it to be common sense that this institution will do what it says that it does. We're going to need to reform it, and we're going to need to address those problems. And this has to be a common sense within our movement that we're going to do this, that we have an institution at the heart of our media system where journalists are free to report accurately and impartially, independent of the kind of problems which I'm going to raise in a moment. Now, there are two things I want to say about this. I will start by the BBC's response to criticism. What happened when people on the Labour left were complaining about reporting during the last general election? The response from Fran Unsworth in The Guardian was to claim that this was conspiracy theory, retweeted and shared by every single bigwig at the BBC, and then later, the Director General, Tony Hall, sent a message around his staff making the same comment. This is conspiracy theory. We have a large, complex organisation. The idea that we are, of course, trying to re-elect a Tory government, this is madness, okay? Nobody is saying that. Nobody's going around saying that somebody from the top of the BBC sent an edict to people down below that this is how you must report on the Labour Party. What we're saying is there's something institutional about this organisation which leads to particular regularities in its reporting. That is exactly the same claim, incidentally, which is made by defendants of the BBC when they say the BBC is impartial. If you make the claim that the organisation is impartial, that's a claim about the collective nature of the institution, the policies that you have, the conventions that are in place that allow you to report in certain ways. The inverse of that is that there may also be some problems with this organisation. Now, I need to be brief. If you want me to talk at length, then, well, you can buy my book if you want more details. Now, I just want to make some illustrative points, right? I'll start with the general strike, because everyone starts with the general strike. Every account on the BBC acknowledges that the BBC was not impartial during the general strike, and often you will see this quote again and again used where Reeve says, the government can trust us to not be impartial. And even Nick Robinson acknowledges this in his account, right? That none of those accounts get even close to the way the BBC conducted itself. I'm just going to put one comment on this. When the strike finished, right, John Reeve read out over the microphone, "We would like to thank God and the Prime Minister for steering us through this difficult time." And then he read out the words of Jerusalem over the microphone. Right? And I know that there will probably be fans of Jerusalem, I like it as well. But the point is, this was understood to be a nationalist kind of hymn, right? In the last verse of Jerusalem, he got the BBC choir to sing in the background as he read out the last verse. That was BBC impartial reporting at its birth. And some journalists who took the BBC's obligation seriously were shocked by this. Another thing that happened was that the senior figures at the BBC moved into the Admiralty. Which, remember, this is the greatest empire the world has ever seen at this point. It's like CNN moving into the Pentagon. That was the BBC at its birth. Now, the official version of this is that there's this bumpy start somehow. The BBC muddled on through, and things got a little bit less stuffy in the 1960s because ITV came along, and then gradually we had some investigative journalism, and eventually we got an independent BBC. This is extremely complacent, and more to the point, it's not accurate. What actually happened was, yes, the BBC did get more free. But what I want to suggest to you is that we always have, this tells us something fundamental about the BBC. The compromises that were made during the general strike gave us a quasi-state organisation. That's how it was described by Tom Burns in the first major study of the BBC. Called it a quango. Somewhere in between a genuinely independent broadcaster and a state broadcaster, which at times is more free and at times is less free. And governments willing to put their foot on the BBC's neck will constrain the ability of journalists to do their job. But we've had other problems with the BBC. People have talked about the deep state, and I have a chapter in my book, and other people will be familiar with some of this history, about the role that the secret state has played in influencing the BBC in that kind of relationship. But fundamentally, we have a broadcaster whose funding regime is controlled by the government. Now, the official version of this is that the licence fee comes from us, so therefore it makes the BBC independent. Complete nonsense. It's the government that sets the rate of the licence fee, and it's repeatedly used it throughout its history to discipline the BBC. The government has powers of appointments, the government uses the charter. We cannot pretend that the BBC is independent after what happened with Tony Hall and George Osborne, and now with Boris Johnson briefing the media, hopping mad about the fact that Tony Hall has stepped down early and he won't be able to appoint a chair, who's then going to appoint a Director General. Most of us are old enough to remember what happened in the 1980s with Thatcher, right? The BBC has always been a quasi-state broadcaster, but it's got worse. Now, in the official history, which Gene Season produces, the sort of history of like Thatcherism was that, okay, the government attacked the BBC, Murdoch wanted to privatise it, but luckily, you know, they sort of muddled on through, British pragmatism won out in the day, and, you know, public service broadcasting survived. This is not what happened. I remember, I think Stephen Dorrell mentioned earlier about the IEA being marginal in the 1970s. Well, at that point, Michael Swan was having lunch at the Institute for Economic Affairs. And another man who was having lunch at the Institute for Economic Affairs was John Burt. And his friend who took him there was Peter Jay. And I imagine some of these names are familiar to people in the room. What happened at the BBC in the 1990s was those ideas, which we called Thatcherism at the time, or monetarism, but now people refer to it neoliberalism, drive a programme of reform at the BBC, which marketised it, embedded it into the private sector, with the end point that we could create a private market and eventually have a consumer market in the media. That was Peacock's vision. That's where the Tories are going with it, right? We have been losing since that point. There's no point pretending otherwise. If we do not ourselves develop a new vision of what this public media looks like in the 21st century, and that means digital media, it means media which is independent of the government, and it means a media where journalists can do their job and they can investigate and not report gossip that's being fed to them by Number 10, then we are going to lose. And Dominic Cummings is going to eat people alive. And what I'm worried about is liberals offering very complacent defences of the BBC, worried about what Britain would look like without the BBC, without offering any positive vision of what the BBC could be if we could reinvent the BBC for the 21st century. That's what we should be arguing. And I want people to think about that. I think we should defend the BBC from the Johnson government because the BBC belongs to us. But it doesn't belong to us functionally, it should belong to us. It's a public organisation, but which essentially has gone through a process of elite capture. Now, Jeremy Corbyn has some very interesting ideas when he gave us an alternative and Taggart lecture about how we could do this. I've produced a set of proposals for the Media Reform Coalition called Draft Proposals for the BBC Reform, where we set out a programme whereby we could dismantle some of the problems with the BBC, and that means fundamentally, first of all, taking away any government control over the BBC. That means removing their powers of appointments. That means removing their ability to influence funding. It means removing some of the commercial restrictions that prevent the BBC doing good things, like moving into digital, right? All of these things need reform. Now, we are not in a position to be able to do that. But if we're going to defend the BBC, we need to be clear-sighted about the BBC's weakness, and we need to have a programme ready for when we next come back into government for how we are going to reinvent not only the BBC but other public service broadcasters. I wanted to say briefly something about this question of bias. Now, the treatment of Jeremy Corbyn by the BBC should not surprise any of us. And it probably doesn't, right? But it should not have been what the BBC was doing. If you just simply look at their rules, they violated the basic impartiality rules. Why was that going on? As I describe in the book, and as I've sort of summarised here, and I'll finish up very soon, the BBC is a statist organisation, very close to the British state, very close to organisations like the Foreign Office, very close to MI5, right? The BBC from the 1990s not only got commercialised, but there was a very deliberate politically driven process which Nicholas Jones will talk about in some detail from personal experience, whereby social democratic patterns of reporting were removed from the BBC and replaced with business and economics reporting. Peter Jay was brought in, he was a monetarist very explicitly, to head the BBC's economics reporting. Business reporting exploded, and gradually, over the course of the 2000s, the idea of economics reporting got completely conflated with business reporting. What's good for business is good for the economy. What happened to the trade union reporters? What happened to the Labour correspondents? They were all moved sideways, or some of them were just brutally sacked, and you can read about this in my book. There was a process of deliberate, conscious, political and cultural change at the BBC, which you can trace empirically. The record in that is very clear. Along comes Corbyn. The point is that the movement which propelled Corbyn into the forefront was fundamentally two things. Number one, the anti-war movement, from which Corbyn himself comes, and number two, the subsequent anti-austerity movement and to some extent the student fees protests, right? These were completely anathema to the institutional DNA of the BBC, an organisation close to the state and embedded within neoliberal economics. So what do we expect to happen when a politician like Corbyn meets people like that at the BBC? Now, I just want to make a comment about the journalists who work there. I personally think it's defensible for people to criticise people like Laura Kuenssberg. They get paid a lot of money. Of course, everyone must do that politely and rationally and refrain from any kind of abuse. I think we should be calling out any incidents of bias. I think that's our right as citizens. I think fundamentally, of course, we always need to be thinking about how we would restructure these institutions. And just on this question of like the people who work there, I think it's worth mentioning that these people who get paid £200,000 and upwards of that at the BBC, the senior journalists, most of whom not only went to elite universities, but most of whom studied PPE at Oxford. I mean, it's extraordinary the proportion of people who have exactly the same educational background. These are the 1% of the BBC. You remember that Occupy slogan, right? I mean, if you lined up everybody in the BBC in a long, long line, the last 1% would be the people who get paid over £150,000. They are the elite of the BBC. What we should have is a BBC where the workers themselves have more influence in the organisation. I'm glad to hear there's so many trade unionists here today, because the story of the political economy of the British media has been much about crushing the collective power of workers in the industry and restructuring the organisations to curtail the autonomy that they have. And that was also a process at the BBC, by the way, that Bert felt very aggrieved by the power that unions had within the industry. So I think that's very important. Let me just finish briefly on the narrow question of the future of the BBC. Subscription. The government wants to create a subscription service to replace the BBC. We should have absolutely no quarter in opposing this. A subscription service is not public service broadcasting. And by the way, I don't think we should even be talking about public service broadcasting. Television is dead. Television's not dead. Most people don't use television. Television will be dead. Everything which we watch on TV is in the future going to be watched on digital. We need the digital license fee. We need to think about the BBC as being a digital platform. That's the intervention that we should be making. Sorry, I lost my train of thought now. What was I saying? Sorry?
License fee.
License fee, thanks. Yeah, so we should be having a digital license fee. Subscription, this is not a voluntary service, right? The point about the BBC and the point about the license fee is it's a collective claim on our civic and political rights to access to information and our collective shared culture. If we're charging people for access to that, we are repricing them out of their ability to participate in society. That's the argument we should be making about the licence fee. And I think the BBC tripped up on this point because they said with the closing the iPlayer loophole, they buttress this argument that this is a payment for access to BBC programmes. It is not a payment for access to the BBC programmes. It is our collective claim on our democratic public culture. And that's the argument we should be making. We do not want to reproduce a Netflix, but if we're going to sustain the BBC, we have to have a BBC that is more accountable to the public and the society that it represents. And that will mean, I'm afraid, fundamentally transforming the BBC as we find it today into something which we really feel like we could passionately defend. And that's what I hope we will be working on over the next few months and years. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Tom. Very clear, very clearly stated position there. Final speaker, and then it's over to you, Tony Lennon, who worked at the BBC for many, many years. Tony.
As Nick will remember, I don't know if I need this. I don't usually need one, but I'll... That's better. Right, 30, a long time ago, do you know, the first time I stood up and defended the BBC was probably about 35 years ago. And it's interesting that the complaints made about the BBC at that time have been echoed in this room over the course of the morning, exactly the same complaints. And the rationale of the time on the progressive side of things was, well, do you know, if we didn't have the BBC, it probably wouldn't be started up tomorrow. And secondly, why don't we just grab the bits that work and suss out how we can fix the bits that don't work? So I'd agree with quite a lot of what Tom said about a need to revise the way the BBC does things, to revise the way it works. But I think at the end of the day, we've got to leave here with a sense that it is actually, for all its faults, an institution that would never be recreated if it collapsed, and an institution that, if properly held accountable, if it actually does what it says on the tin, yeah, I think we wouldn't be hearing the sort of complaints here. So I suppose, looking back 35 or so years, I'm tempted to say plus the change, but things have changed. Yes, there used to be a situation where the BBC had a few friends on the right and more friends on the left. And over that period, the complaints on the left about the BBC have become more and more vociferous. Almost entirely without its news coverage, actually. And I think it's worth remembering the BBC isn't just about news, it does a lot of other stuff as well. So the friendship on the political spectrum has changed. But also, so has the nature of the political attacks that governments have made on the BBC. Once upon a time, when they attacked the BBC, it was not quite as noisy as people like Johnson and Cummings have been in the last year, and there was often a bit of dressing up going on. There'd be some sort of due process. You know, you mentioned Peacock, there'd become some sort of independent inquiry. You know, a decade after Peacock, we had was it Phillips, where there's the Davies report, Gavin Davies report, just before the year 2000, again an independent inquiry. Now what we have is a sham, right, public consultation led by the government over the decriminalisation of licence fee evasion, which is basically an effort by this government to turn the BBC licence fee into a voluntary payment. That's where they're going, and we can't quantify the effect of that voluntarism, but no doubt it will seriously diminish what the BBC is doing. Tom made the point that broadcasting, in the sense that we know it, is probably on the way out. And I think you're right. Print is on the way out, right? Print sales of newspapers are diminishing year on year on year. what broadcasters do is easily transferable into the new world of online because it is basically the creation of audiovisual content of one sort and another. And I think we've got to be able to let the BBC follow the developments subject to operating properly. I'll just go back to Peacock actually, because I lived through it, and it was really an invitation from Margaret Thatcher for an independent inquiry to conclude that the BBC should be either wholly or partly funded by advertising. Because there were a lot of economists on there, they came to the conclusion, based on lots of work they did on elasticity of demand for advertising airtime, that actually it wouldn't work. Thatcher was most upset about that, and the BBC to this day has not had to carry advertising. Actually, unlike most other public broadcasters in advanced economies, with the exception of 3 Scandinavian countries, we're about the only one that doesn't have an element of advertising in the state broadcaster. They did make a few suggestions that mostly got lost. They recommended that a conditional access module, right, to the beginnings of subscription should be put on every TV set. This didn't quite happen. What did happen was the SCART socket, all right, got Peacock to thank for that, and it did actually make a difference. They recommended the privatisation of Radio 1 and Radio 2, which if it had happened at that point in time would probably have killed, right, national independent radio, which hadn't really started at all at that point. They recommended the licence fee should be tied to RPI, which it has been on and off, and they gave the BBC responsibility for collection of the licence fee, which became very important. Thatcher's response to Peacock was, as so many politicians have done, to instead of going along with the recommendations, to ignore most of them, and instead bash the BBC by imposing a 3-year freeze in RPI increases to the licence fee. And this was a reversion to type, really, because the way into the BBC that I've observed over 35 years is if government is a bit fed up with what the BBC is doing, they strangle their funding. Okay, or they put their foot on the neck of the BBC by inhibiting its ability to do things because it hasn't got enough money. The BBC proved to be remarkably resilient. I'm going to do some factual stuff that is worth understanding about the BBC. There are 3 hidden accelerators to BBC income. One, going back to 1968, but it sustained through the 70s and 80s, was the switch from monochrome licences, black and white, to colour licences, which were much more expensive. So in the background, whatever the government did to the BBC, people were going from a licence that would cost, in these days, about £52 up to one that cost the £154.50, all right? So over that period of time, lots of people started paying a lot more to the BBC. Second hidden accelerator was the growth in households. Right? There's been a significant growth in the number of people, for example, who live alone. There's been significant growth since the 60s in the population. All of this means new households paying the licence fee. Right? Happens behind the scenes, nobody talks about it very much, but it's a really important accelerator. And probably the last accelerator is improved enforcement, because once the BBC had the power to improve its income by running the enforcement mechanism and making sure that people paid, they actually did quite a good job of it. And enforcement is now way below the levels that we saw in the 70s and 80s, except in some pockets like the north of Ireland, for obvious reasons. So that's worth knowing. And the second investigation that I lived through was the Davies report in 1999. The Secretary of State at the time was Chris Smith, and the result of it was that yet again, right, a review of the BBC's funding came to the conclusion that the licence fee was the least bad system, and Smith did something quite remarkable actually. He unpicked a 5-year formula that had been put in place by the Tories, and he replaced an RPI minus formula with an RPI plus formula. The purpose of doing that was to aid the BBC's development of digital stuff, because at that time the BBC, even on world scale, was a bit of a first mover. And if you look back to the time this was going on, most people didn't get digital. John Burke, who was the Director General at the time, got a lot of stick from people like me, and probably people like Nick, for investing all this money in this kind of unicorn type technology that nobody really understands and they haven't got. If you look back at that period, if the BBC had not done what it did with digital, at a time when the politicians didn't really understand what was going on, they would not have been allowed to do it. They wouldn't have been allowed to do it because the competition that they now present to commercial operators of information platforms and entertainment platforms would have been intolerable, certainly to a Tory government. I don't know what Labour would have made of it, but that's worth remembering. And Bert took a lot of stick, but I think one of the things he did do that was positive for the BBC was to get it into the digital world way ahead of anybody else. And as I say, I don't think they'll be allowed to do it now. This year, we have a consultation on decriminalisation of licence fee payment, which, as I said, is an obvious effort to make the licence fee in some way voluntary. I know there's a lot of emotion about this, but the reality is the latest MOJ figures reveal that in the course of a year, there were 18 criminal prosecutions that led to imprisonment for non-payment of the licence fee. Now, out of something like 23 households paying the licence fee, let's be honest, that's not a significant proportion. If any of those are there because they are in economic difficulty, well, I agree they shouldn't be. But if people willfully avoid paying taxes, which the BBC licence fee is, right, there is at the end of the day a criminal sanction, right, to encourage them to pay it. Council tax, criminal sanction. Income tax, criminal sanction. Vehicle excise licence, criminal sanction. And why shouldn't there be a criminal sanction at the far end of a process of trying to enforce a tax called the BBC licence fee? And it is a collective payment that gives us agency, right, on a collective basis to actually expect the BBC to work in the way that it promises and actually says on the tin. So, why is this being done and what sort of arguments are being floated? Well, we've heard all the stuff about Boris Johnson, Cummings, the British Brexit Corporation, all that kind of stuff. But actually the arguments being articulated are, they at least on paper look rational. Well, one is, perhaps not rational, is the BBC is a left-wing organisation, right? Don't make me laugh, please. Don't make me laugh. We've already seen, I'll do my baignoire, okay? Nigel Farage, right? The only MEP who gets any airtime whatsoever in this country, apart from local radio, when do you ever see a member of the European Parliament, right, being treated seriously by the media? Farage was on the box, on the radio, incessantly, right, during the discussion about Brexit and the referendum, and since. And he hasn't elected office, but in terms of British politics, right, that's all he's got. It's all he's got for a period. He wasn't even in a political party. So Farage on the box all the time. Climate change. I really am tired of listening to debates on news programmes and current affairs programmes where, with a mistaken interpretation of impartiality and or balance, right, somebody who's making a case that is supported by 99.5% of the scientific community, it is then followed by that brilliant climate scientist, Nigel Lawson, right? Okay, who gets the same airtime, the same respect and the same credibility. Now that is not balance, that's a mistake. But my next baignoire, and I'm trying to appeal to Tom here because I am defending the BBC, but I can know its weaknesses, is fascists on broadcast media. Nick Griffin, okay, Tommy Robinson, people who are not there to exercise free expression, they are there to incite hatred. That's why they're there on the media, and the BBC should not be a platform for them. My last one, when you tell me the BBC is a left-wing organisation, its flagship radio and current affairs programme, the Today programme, is currently being edited by Sarah Sands, an ex-editor of London's right-wing mouthpiece of the London Evening Standard, who was followed, right, her successor at the Evening Standard was an ex-Tory Chancellor. Now you're telling me this is a left-wing organisation. I was completely mad. Right, criticism number two, the BBC is kind of outdated and not innovative. Well, that's because there have been times in its history when it has tried to be innovative and it's been stopped. And the one that strikes me most clearly is, in the world of online streaming, once again, the BBC was first out of the traps on a world level with a thing called Project Kangaroo. Remember that? Okay? gets referred to the then Competition Commission, and the resulting decision was, because the BBC and the other public service broadcasters are so large in the marketplace, you're not allowed to do it BBC. And we then see a sort of very pale imitation of what could have been a publicly oriented streaming platform. We then see this BritBox thing, which frankly is just one now in a crowded marketplace and probably 10 years too late. Next criticism is the complete irrelevance of the BBC as a market player when there's so much else around. I think people need to consider, right, a few facets of the Netflix world, as they call it. First important facet is that most of them don't make any money, and you begin to wonder how long they're going to be around. The only two that actually make money are Amazon, which is basically a supermarket with a little media thing on the side, because Amazon wants a slice of everything in the world. The other one is Apple, of course, which is for logo fanatics, and Apple are in the game partly because they want stuff to appear on new telephones as a means of encouraging people to go and buy new phones, because we're buying fewer and fewer new phones now. I think we're featured out. There's so many things on your average smartphone, you don't really need a new one. The other point is, who are they making programmes for and why are they making them? The big streaming outfits, and they're spending a fortune on content at the moment. They're actually making them for a world audience, and they're making them for profit. They're not making them in the spirit of public service, the spirit of adding something positive to the culture and democracy of a specific country. They're making it for a world audience. And at some point in the future, it is likely they will reach a zenith where the back catalogue is now so full that nobody, if they lived for 100 years, could watch all of it. And at that point, they're going to start depending on the archive function rather than new production, which from a cultural point of view is not a good thing, but I suspect that's where they're going to end up. The last thing about the streaming companies is who are they accountable to? Now, we know who the BBC is accountable to. We know who the other major public broadcasters, ITV, Channel 3, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5. We know that they are accountable to Ofcom. We know they are indirectly accountable to us because Ofcom is a public body. But who's Amazon accountable to? Who's Netflix accountable to? Who are these platforms actually accountable to? The answer is nobody except shareholders. And do you really want the media space in the UK to be totally dominated by operators who are not accountable in any serious way to the society that they're serving? And the last point about the streaming services is where does news fit in and where does radio fit in? Okay? BBC, massive provider of radio services, probably admired across the world for the quality of its proposition. What's Netflix doing? Nothing on the scale that the BBC does, even though Netflix is now massively larger than the BBC in terms of revenue. Moving on to this concept of the government trying to make the BBC licence fee voluntary, have we got an example of public service broadcasting being funded on a voluntary basis? Yes, we have, a very good one in the United States of America. We've got the public broadcasting system, we've got the PRI, Public Radio International, and we've got PBS. All of these organisations, they limp along in a massively bigger market than our one. I think the battery's gone on now. Yeah, that's right. They limp along in this massively larger market than ours is, and nevertheless, they struggle when they do their funding appeals, which are a regular feature of those outlets. They struggle to raise enough money to make any serious dent in the world of cable and the world of satellite that we see in the USA. And actually, on PBS's side, which is the TV public service entity, if it wasn't for BBC content, they'd have had practically nothing to show. Practically nothing to show. So we have an example of voluntary public service broadcasting. It doesn't actually work in the way that we like it to. On the subject of the USA, could I just make a point here? In terms of the operation of the BBC, we may have a problem lying ahead. The US Trade Representative's Office, which is basically the President, has already published its bargaining objectives for a free trade agreement with the UK. Now, we need that free trade agreement because it's our biggest single trading partner, and it is the only large economy where we have a trading surplus in both services and goods. Everywhere else, right, our trading surplus in services is all cancelled out, usually, by the trading deficit in goods. So we need this agreement with Donald bloody Trump, God help us. Already in the bargaining objectives that the USTA has published, we know that they will be looking for state subsidies to cause no harm to the United States. It's written there absolutely clear. And what the US government has done in the past, ever since the trade agreement with Canada and Mexico in 1992, NAFTA, what they've done with every trade agreement is to start by saying there will be no cultural carve-out. Now, depending on how the bargaining goes and how strong that the other party is, usually there's a bit of a climb back from no cultural carve-out. But what they mean is we don't want state subsidies distorting a market where we've got an interest. And at the end of the day, you know, even quite large companies like Argentina and South Korea have ended up having to make concessions on their cultural infrastructure to satisfy the US and to get the deal. And in our case, the two things they're going to be after will be quotas, because we're still abiding by the Audiovisual and Media Services Directive, quotas of European content, and that's not to do with the European Union, it's defined by the Council of Europe, quotas of 50% on regulated TV and 30% on regulated, on all streaming. Right, that's going to be their first target because they want American movies everywhere, you know. Their second target will be things like the BBC licence fee and the money that we give to culture generally, where we're spending about £1.5 billion a year helping out orchestras, helping out arts centres, etc., etc. They'll be after that because it's a market distortion and it doesn't exist in the USA. If you've ever wondered why are cultural institutions in the USA always named after people, that's because they're the people who paid to build them. You know, concert halls, theatres, galleries, it's all built with private money. So just watch out for the US trade negotiations. I'll finish by just doing the good points about the BBC. The licence fee is the least bad way of giving us a rich mix of programming that ought to be accountable to us. It is free at the point of consumption. Again, this is important, especially to a generation of kids who do expect to get things either for nothing or for very little indeed. It's got a strong cultural role. I won't go into just how much effect it has on the UK's cultural infrastructure, but it does. It has a social purpose, which these streaming companies don't, and for that matter, nor do normal regulated broadcasters. If it wasn't for the regulations, then commercial broadcasters wouldn't really think of that social purpose. And it's value for money. All right, I'll just leave you with this thought. I mentioned colour came in 1968. The value of the licence fee in 1968 at today's prices is £175, which is about 20 quid more than you pay at the moment. And that was for 2 TV channels, one of which, well, they both ran for about 12 hours a day most days except weekends. 4 radio channels. World Service was funded by the government, now funded by the BBC. And the internet hadn't even been invented, all right? So think about that. You know, the value for money argument is a fairly good one, especially for anyone who's wondering, anyone who's a football fan or a sports fan generally, which you used to get for nothing, or payment of the licence fee. The subscription charges without fits like Sky, if you want the full package, are eye-wateringly expensive compared to the nearly £150 BBC licence fee. And I'll sort of finish on the financial front. There's an election going on in Ireland today. I've been dipping in and out of the Irish press to see what's going on. And once again, I find that RTE, the Irish state broadcaster, is moaning, well, quite rightly moaning, is drawing attention to the perils of its funding because it's 1/3 funded by advertising and it's 2/3 funded by a licence fee, which is €160 per household. There aren't many households, so you don't actually get much from RTE for your money. but they're pointing to the perils of non-household donations and subscriptions. They're pointing to the perils of that form of funding and are talking about cutting services. So I'll finish at that point, but I'm really concentrating on the dangers of the BBC not being around because its funding gets squeezed by government. If it does get squeezed, one thing will happen, which is that the BBC will begin to diminish, and I think there's a lot of consequences to that for all its faults. One thing won't happen if the BBC's funding gets squeezed, and that is it won't get any bolder. So if you want a bolder BBC, you've really got to have a properly funded BBC. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tony. Right, it's over to you. Questions? If you're going to make contributions, keep them snappy. We've got just over 20 minutes. I'm going to take people who haven't contributed before.
My name's John Hanson. I've run an online petition against anti-Corbyn bias on the BBC. About 26,000 signatures for that petition because people are basically angry with the way that the news on the BBC is reported during this last election. Basically, we might like other parts of the BBC, we might like wildlife and all the other stuff, but what we don't like is the way that the news has been reported, and people are very angry about the BBC going ape on the news. If 78% of people get the feed from it, then that means the democracy is in the hands of the BBC, and they've got to be more responsible with that. It's politicised because Cameron famously said he'd fix it. He populated the BBC with Conservatives, and unless it's depoliticalised, all the other things won't matter. It doesn't matter about having good foot sport, good education, good wildlife. If we've no democracy, it doesn't count for a great deal.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, okay, I'm Russell Jackson from Sheffield Hallam, an academic there. I just want to underline a couple of quick points. One is that with the establishment bias, it's not just the kind of 1% with the Andrew Neils and the Nick Robinsons, who's chair of the Young Conservatives, for example. Right at the top, David Clementi advised the Thatcher government on privatisation of BT, along with 40 other privatisations. So the bias is absolutely institutional. A couple of quick changes on the bigger, wider context. The first is the breakdown in trust in British society. The least trusted professions in British society now are politicians, closely followed by journalists. The most trusted are scientists and experts/academics. There's an inverse relationship to the people who get coverage in the BBC. So the BBC should be making itself distinctive and putting forward those trusted voices rather than the deeply untrusted voices. The other final point I want to say briefly is that, yes, the BBC has to be competitive, but the main metric now for media is clicks, viewing figures, audiences, and the thing that drives that now is controversy. So we have Piers Morgan, Julia Hartley-Brewer, all these kind of people. All the debates are framed around a quick interrogation with a gotcha attitude. And what the BBC should be doing is going back to something like the pre-Common Market membership interview with Harold Wilson, where there was a detailed, extended, calm, measured view. And that's how the BBC, in part, can be distinctive.
I'm Trevor Hoyle. I'm a writer, a fiction writer. This morning's session, I thought I'd walked into a Labour Party trade union meeting, which I'm not complaining about, except I think it was conflating two issues. One was the treatment of Corbyn and Labour, the last election, and the media more generally. And I think that those are two separate discussions we should be having. People have been asking all the time, how can we improve the BBC? I can do it. I've got two answers for you. One is you could save 1.75 million by getting rid of Gary Lineker, or paying a reasonable salary. Why do people like that have to be paid £2 million? People like Graham Norton. we're talking, they're saying having to sack journalists. How many journalists could you afford to pay if you paid Politico a reasonable salary? And the other thing is that all the remedies of the BBC, I think, have been tinkering around the edges. There's one very simple way to do it, and that's the education intake of the BBC. It's been mentioned here, I think Mr. Dorrell mentioned it before. When you've got a disproportionate number of people coming from private education and coming from Oxbridge, their entire worldview is fashioned by that education. An oldie but a goodie. Some of you will remember Andrew Marr interviewing Noam Chomsky about 15 years ago. And Marr, it was about the book, The Manufacturing Consent, and Marr got very nettled. He said, "Are you suggesting that my editor tells me what to do and what to think?" And Chomsky said, "No, I'm not saying that at all. In fact, I think you believe everything you say." But if you didn't believe it, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting. Now that is the number one problem of the BBC. You're not going to change it with all this tinkering about with license fees. That's all peripheral. It's important, but peripheral. Unless you get a new intake, a more representative intake of people from this country at the senior levels in the BBC, editorial manager and on the board of directors, nothing will change.
I just wanted to talk to the last points. I think the structure of the BBC and the media is political. I mean, that's why we're discussing both. They both concern the distribution of power in society. They both concern how we understand that. And the reason why I think people are talking about the treatment of the Labour Party is because it's illustrative of the BBC not doing what it's supposed to do, right? So that's the answer to that. I agree with your points on pay. The reason they ended up getting paid so much, by the way, is that the BBC was quite deliberately marketised, and then the argument became, well, we need to retain our talent. The deal was originally, you're at the BBC, you have a secure job for life, it has good status, and therefore you can be paid less. The pay incrementals at the BBC exploded during the 1990s and into the noughties, and they continued to damp it down a bit under Thompson. So this is the predictable effect of what happens with marketisation, and I agree. I mentioned the educational background of the people who work at the BBC. The BBC, of course, has to be more representative. And I think that people should not be paid huge amounts of that. We shouldn't have a 1% of the BBC with this tiny elite. Maybe we could have pay incrementals at the BBC, a pay ratio, where the people at the top aren't paid more than the people at the bottom. I think that would be a good thing. I think it's a perfectly reasonable one to make. I just want to make one comment about whether that's the core question. The question of the licence fee is peripheral. No, I don't agree with that. I think these are all part of the same picture. We have to change the personnel, and we have to change the structures, and we need to think about all these things together. And I'm not disagreeing with any of the points you made, but I don't think that's the fundamental point, and the relationship with the government or the licence fee is the peripheral point. I think they're all impacting on the overall culture of the BBC, but importantly, I think they're things which we can address, actually relatively straightforwardly.
John?
So just again on the last point about the astronomical 1% salaries of BBC talent, I just wanted to sort of bring that into some of the arguments that were made around the equal pay cases that we had and that are still ongoing in some respects. Saying, well, we shouldn't be having to make these big payouts. It's unfair. I mean, these disgraceful arguments trying to weasel their way out of huge inequalities in pay. I just think it's a really disingenuous kind of approach to it. But clearly there are all sorts of problems, structural problems within the BBC that do need to be addressed, and that's just one of them. But you can't get away with unequal pay and kind of fob it off as an excuse.
Okay, thanks. Tony?
Okay, I'll take with this it was Russell, wasn't it? Talked about trust, yeah? Look, I think trust is an issue which is going to become more and more important. If we're moving into the world of clicks and social media and stuff, where, in the old days, your average nutter could probably influence 5 people in the pub. They've now got an audience of 500, 5,000, 50,000, 500,000. None of it's intermediated. And people are just left to work out for themselves, well, what's the right and what's the wrong. I think in that kind of world, there's a real need for trusted sources, and I think played properly, the BBC should be one of those trusted sources that really do. Subject to accountability, subject to a whole load of things, but I think that's important for the future. In terms of the demographic of the BBC, yeah, look, it has always favoured Oxbridge and Redbrick universities for some of its top jobs, particularly in areas like news and current affairs, and quite a lot of production departments. There is a problem across the media, and actually across the entertainment sector at the moment. It's not the only industry that's got it, which is that because you often have to go and work for nothing or not very much in order to break into your chosen profession, we're seeing people who can rely on the bank of mum and dad, which is basically young white kids, yeah? Let's be blunt about it. They're the ones who get in the bottom rung of the ladder, and once you're on the bottom rung, the only way is upwards, okay? But you got in there because you could afford to work for nothing. And I think you're absolutely right, Lucy. The demographic is changing as it's changing in the rest of the media. There are fewer working class people at the BBC than I remember when I first started working there in the mid-70s. And this obviously has to have an effect on all its output, not just the way news is run. I was around for the explosion of BBC dramas, particularly studio dramas, which is a bit of a new genre, actually. And most of the producers of those programmes were working class people. Yeah? And they put the BBC at the forefront of the cutting-edge drama developments in the UK. And we're not seeing those working class people in areas like that. So I'm totally with you. I'm not sure from a statutory and regulatory point of view quite how we do it, but for the whole economy, we've got to deal with this problem of young people having to work for nothing before they can get into a career.
Hi, Stanford Still Wallasey CLP were one of 4 very Labour-led constituencies now on the entire world, and joined with our Labour members in Greater Merseyside. And we've had a very direct approach to unacceptable media practice, as you'll all know, in the last 20 odd years, the total eclipse of the sun. People don't buy it, they pass that message on. They pass that message on to their kids. And what's beginning to happen now in our constituency over Christmas is the debate has gone to we'll cancel our licence fee, and from the debate, people are now actually doing that. And as Sian, you said before, of course, you made a very human comparison between journalists and postmen, you know. And part of the problem, really, in a sense, is that the anger that's felt towards BBC over the coverage in recent times is akin to a postman coming up your path and ripping up your letters before they put them through the postbox. And I think that's the anger, the root of it. And it conflates with, or it's in alignment with, the kind of complacency that you mentioned, Tom, with regard to the BBC, a younger demographic who won't see the reason for paying a subscription or a licence, and the attack of the Tory government. And I was hoping that today, maybe, and onwards, we have some opportunity to discuss how we take public control of this debate, because this isn't just a threat to the BBC, it's a threat to our basic democracy. And I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. So that's my hope and desire from today, to move that debate forward if we can. Thank you.
Next person.
Have we got a woman's view here?
I'll do my best. Richard House, Gloucestershire Labour Party. I want to just go back to 2005-2006, when the Conservative Party lost a second successive general election, and they had a new leader. And one of the responses, or an important response, was to set up some centres, some research centres that would look into important issues. One of them was headed by, I'm about to swear, Ian Duncan Smith, headed up the Centre for Social Justice. As Tom Lehrer famously said, satire is dead. Anyway, what I want to say is, Labour now needs to do the same thing. And it would be wonderful if they would set up a research centre into the future of the media, and it was headed up by Tom and by Justin and by you folks, so that we can start preparing our policy for the next general election, and we can be seen to be doing it in a very proactive, thoughtful way. Thank you.
from London. This is purely anecdotal. This week, I live in East London. I was at my hairdresser's, and she proceeded with this absolute diatribe against Jeremy Corbyn, along the lines of she doesn't normally vote because most politicians are corrupt. She didn't particularly want to vote for Boris Johnson, but she was so terrified that that man Corbyn should be running the country. He was a friend of terrorists, a friend of the IRA, anti-Semitic, etc., etc. She's 50-something. A lot of her clientele, I'm sure, think the same. And I was very taken, I think it was you who made the point earlier, about most people just simply not being that interested. Anyway, then she went on to say, and don't get me started on the BBC, it is not fit for purpose. So I tentatively asked her why she thought that, because she had a pair of scissors. And she said, well, it was their coverage of Brexit. So what can I say? Purely anecdotal, but my question since then has been, should I keep going there? But I live in East London. Then most established, a lot of establishments are bigoted, but how do we get through to people who are not that interested, but pick up these simplistic messages, not just about Corbyn and the left generally, but as we're here today, specifically about the BBC, and that's before the licence fee. By the way, the main point of interest in the salon that day was Philip Schofield coming out, for what it's worth.
My name's Megan Edwards. I'm just wondering, in all of this debate in this organisation and in the BBC, how you see us moving forward in terms of structural racism and systemic racism, both in the media, in journalism and in society as general, and how we can use these kind of forums to move forward in that respect.
Neil Terra from Morning Star newspaper. Well, a couple of quick points and then a question. First quick point, the point that you raised about Gary Lineker. I'm sure there's many younger people than me that probably think, why on earth is Chris Salesman presenting a football programme? Second point, Nigel Farage. Why do we call him Farage? Call him Farage in the same way we call sausage in a garage. It's Farage. Okay? Now let's call him by what he is. Right? My third thing is about, because the BBC have been really pushing on user-generated content. Do you see that as a threat to journalism, or is it something that can improve journalism? Because of course most people these days have a camera in their pockets, on their phones, so does it increase it, does it decrease it? Is it good for us?
I think I'd just make a kind of very general point. The world without the BBC would feel very different, but it's hard to imagine it. I suspect we would see, if we're totally dependent on profit-driven media to enrich our culture and to give us news and encourage debate, I think our world would be a poorer place without the BBC, which is why I am arguing, as I have done for 35 years, that despite all its faults, we should keep it and improve it rather than punish it, and this government is definitely trying to punish it. Some of the complaints, and Kathy, I'm astonished that anybody could say the BBC's coverage of Brexit, if I'm guessing where they came from, but I'll leave it at that. Just that, the thoughts I wanted to take away is the BBC is actually at serious threat, and it is existential. The BBC's not perfect, but if we actually had a socialist paradise that I know many of you would like to see, we'd probably have something like the BBC, we'd just make it work better.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Sian?
Thank you. So there were some really, really big questions there, like Megan's question about how do we, tackle systemic racism in the media and society. I mean, you could have an entire conference about that. I think it's obviously really different in different media outlets. I think you could argue that some media outlets are institutionally racist. I would say that the BBC is not one of those. I think one of the most effective ways of tackling racism in a workplace is by having a very well organised trade union. Obviously, I would say that is the NUJ and our colleagues in Bectu, now Prospects and elsewhere, across the BBC. And in terms of that question about pushing user-generated content, so the NUJ's position on that, largely is that if you are a working journalist creating content, you should be paid a fair wage for your job, for your work and your content. And there is a bit of a grey area around some of that. We've seen a lot, especially in newspapers, where newspapers have sort of taken photographs which have been sent in and then they've laid off their photographers. We've seen similar with kind of unpaid for comment pieces, which is about people actually paying to have comment pieces, and it's a bit vague about the arrangement by which this comment piece has appeared in the newspaper, rather than a professional journalist being paid a wage for producing a piece of content. Actually, there is somebody who wants to appear in a newspaper, and instead of it being badged as an advertorial, they are still paying to have that page. There's a bit of an arrangement like that with the Scotsman newspaper, and I think it's a bit of a dodgy area. One last
Can I just cut? Tom's got to go and get his train, I forgot.
Yeah.
So can we let Tom have his last words? And he's got a leg. I've given him 7 minutes to get his train.
Right, yeah, I'm going to miss my train, so I'm going to be very brief, and then, sorry, I had to rush off. I just wanted to stress the point of racism, because I don't think it's something that's got enough attention in the discussion so far. It's a complicated question, obviously, but as far as the BBC goes, I think we have to have representation of the diversity of the UK at the executive board level and at journalist level, and across the BBC, so the BBC needs to be more representative. But we need to also acknowledge, and obviously we're talking more about the broader media here, that a lot of the racism in British society, let's be frank, is driven by the right-wing press, and one of the central problems of the BBC is it allows those interests to drive the nature of the political conversation and debates, which is why people are having these absurd discussions on the BBC about whether racism exists in society. Well, it was mentioned by Russ earlier about the role of academics. Nobody would have a debate in academia as to whether racism exists, because it does, and this is just slipping into the realm of post-truth, and it's absurd, and it's being driven by racist institutions in society. So the BBC shouldn't be giving time to those institutions, basically, and I've got to go. So thanks very much.
And I only wanted to say one final point on just kind of hopefully tipping into wider discussion is that I think universalism is like the key to which we should be approaching the BBC and protecting public service broadcasting. So in the same way that, universal access to education, universal access to healthcare, free at the point of use, as you mentioned earlier, I think we really have to take as a sort of campaigning approach to this. We have to think about universalism in public service broadcasting and all of the good that comes with that.
Thank you ever so much. I think that was a really good session. Some really top-class speeches, and I think it's given us some food for thought. I just want to mention, you triggered it actually when you talked about the Sun on Merseyside. The North West Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom had a meeting in the Bluecoats immediately after. Were you there? Right. There was a meeting, it was a packed meeting, where we knew what the truth was then. And we were attacked for organising it because it seemed that we were the ones who were attacking the newspapers because they were telling the truth and we weren't. That's where the boycott of the Sun started. It was a Communist Party member, he's dead now. He stood up and he said, we have to boycott the paper. And I'm proud we had the meeting, and I'm proud that the Sun actually isn't sold on Merseyside. Amazing, after all these years, that is still solid.
Send letters on.
So,